Hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to the Senate Budget Committee today. As we discussed in our committee meeting last week, Senator Sessions and I are working to write a joint letter to be submitted to the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction with recommendations from our committee on reforming certain aspects of the budget process. Our letter will focus on areas where there is broad consensus within the committee. Today's hearing follows up on certain issues members raised last week. In particular, today we'll consider whether the administration should be involved in the budget resolution. I think this will come as a surprise to most Americans who may be listening that they're not. But the fact is the budget resolution is entirely a congressional proceeding. The President does not sign it. While he does submit a budget to us, he does not have a role in passing a budget resolution in the Congress. Today's hearing follows up on those issues as well as talking about options for encouraging congressional action on budget resolutions, because I think one of the great frustrations of this committee, and we have seen this repeatedly, especially in election year, is budget resolutions are not being passed. We have three knowledgeable witnesses with us today. Dr. Louis Fisher, a scholar in residence at the Constitution Project. Dr. Philip Joyce, Professor of Management, Finance, and Leadership at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. And Dr. Paul Posner, the Director of the Centers on the Public Service at George Mason University's Department of Public and International Affairs. Welcome to you all. These are really three excellent witnesses on the subjects we have before us. I want to begin just by briefly highlighting how a joint budget resolution might work. And I want to acknowledge the work of our colleague, Senator Thune, who has presented his own proposal that was well thought through, I thought, and carefully done. First, Congress would pass a joint budget resolution which the President would then sign. The joint budget resolution would become a statute with the force of law. It would no longer be a congressional-only budget framework. Here are some of the options for what could happen if the President and Congress failed to reach agreement on a joint budget resolution. We could add expedited procedures for a concurrent resolution, a congressional-only resolution, if the President vetoes the joint resolution. And we could provide for an automatic continuing resolution if appropriation bills are not enacted before the beginning of the fiscal year. Here are some of the arguments for moving to a joint budget resolution. Number one, it would encourage an upfront comprehensive agreement on budget issues. Two, it would bring the President to the negotiating table earlier in the process. And this may help provide clarity to the process and decrease brinksmanship later in the year. And it could strengthen budget enforcement with the addition of statutory provisions. But there are also arguments on the other side against moving to a joint budget resolution, and we have certainly heard them, especially in this last week, as we have considered our recommendations. One, it would create a new fast-track vehicle for making substantive statutory changes. This means it would be possible to enact statutory budget enforcement changes with only a majority vote. For example, the sequesters that we just established in the Budget Control Act could be turned off with a simple majority vote. I must say I had not personally thought of that, but it is something we need to consider. Line item veto could be enacted with a simple majority vote. Second, requiring the President to agree on the budget would also increase the likelihood of delays in the budget and appropriations process. It's hard enough to reach agreement between the Senate and the House. In fact, in recent years, it's proved impossible. Adding the President to the mix might make it that much harder and that much more likely there would be no agreement at all. Third, moving to a joint budget resolution would also shift some power to the executive branch. It would undermine the congressional independence and limit Congress's power of the purse, which was really, as I go back to the history, how we got into this to begin with, as part of the '74 reforms.
You remember that?
No, I don't. But I've gone back and we've researched this. How did we, what was the rationale? What was the argument that was advanced? Because, you know, it is counterintuitive that you do it the way we do it. I mean, frankly, as somebody that comes from an executive branch of government before I served here, what Senator Thune is proposing appeals to me as sort of a commonsensical way to proceed with the budget. So I think there are strong arguments on both sides of this, and today's hearings will also consider measures we could adopt to encourage Congress to pass a budget, additional tools that could be given to strengthen the need to do a budget in these chambers. We could strengthen the budget committees by increasing their membership to include members of the Democratic and Republican leadership as well as committee chairs. The original idea of the Budget Committee is that the chairs of the Finance Committee and the Appropriations Committee would serve here. And for many years that was the case. You'll recall Senator Byrd served here. Before that, Chairman of the Finance Committee served here. And it was really designed to be made up of the chairs of the key committees. And now we've gotten away from that over the years to the detriment, I think, of writing budgets. We could strengthen the right of senators to proceed to and debate a budget resolution if the Budget Committee or the Senate fails to act. This I find particularly appealing because I've found in arguments or discussions with leadership, when you point out if the Budget Committee fails to act, any member can bring a budget to the floor. Right? If we don't act by April 15th, any senator can bring a budget to the floor. The problem is you still face procedural hurdles. And the deference given to the majority leader really has precluded, even though a budget is filed, from having a motion to proceed. And that, I think, is something we really need to think carefully about. If the Budget Committee fails to act, any senator can file a budget. Go to the floor and file a budget. The key then is, how do you get it before the body? You still face a motion to proceed. And I think we have to discuss how we could strengthen that right of a senator, if the Budget Committee fails to act, to get a budget considered by our colleagues. As we've already discussed, we could reform the vote-a-rama process to encourage a more substantive floor debate. We could create a 60-vote point of order against appropriation, spending, and revenue bills until a budget resolution is enacted. Senator Cardin has put together, I think, a very constructive proposal to require other business basically to stop until a budget resolution is produced. And we could establish an automatic trigger with spending and tax expenditure reductions as a consequence for not enacting a budget resolution. Let me just say, after hundreds of hours of negotiations with Republicans and Democrats on possible triggers, I don't think that has much prospect. I mean, I've spent hundreds of hours on possible triggers, and I've not been able to find a place where both sides could agree. So we'd like to hear our witnesses' views on these possible incentives and welcome any additional ideas in this area.